Hello, everyone, and welcome to Timo and Julian Talk Philosophy. Hello, Julian. Ce mai
Hey,
faci?
hey, Sumbine. So I wanted to respond once like in Romanian too. I'm
Sunt,
great and it's great to be back on like the show.
Sunt bine, mulțumesc.
Oh, you are making progresses.
Thank you. But mulțumesc mult. But today we are not alone. For the first time, we have a guest in our show, and I also welcome Julien Sita. Guten Abend, Julian.
Hello, how are you guys?
It's actually difficult to keep you both Julian and Julia.
It's basically the same name but in different languages.
So I should rather say Guten Abend, Julia. So that was Luxembourgish, and so we have today a guest from Luxembourg. And and he is studying philosophy and history at Trier University in Germany. And today we will go to Greek philosophy and we will talk about Aristotle. At first, Julien, you might tell us a bit about Aristotle himself and his achievement.
Thank you. Yes, Aristotle is one of the greatest. This is one of the greatest philosopher in ancient Greece. He is basically the one who I think is in the top 10 or in the top 3 of the most influential and hardworking philosopher.
So what does him differ from Plato?
I would say he completed in some ways Plato's work. Plato's philosophy with a new system. He was heavily influenced by his master's teaching. Plato gave him many ideas and inspiration, but he evaluated his baggage he took from his master to own system of ideas, which is quite remarkable and which became even more independent, but remarkably influenced by from his master.
Well, if I think of Aristotle, I think of two things. The first thing is that he rejected Plato's teaching of ideas. Yes. And the second is I think of his organon as father of logic.
Yes, we can say that Aristotle founded a kind of a school of logic, or first very systematic logical teachings, but even if he rejected the teaching of ideas of his master Plato, he came up with a category system which was a bit similar and which is also quite remarkable.
So just for those who do not know the impact of Aristotle yet, I think we should make a very, very small scientific discourse through history so that everyone has the same knowledge and that we can go into actually discussing a work of Aristotle. So the very key is like when we take Greek philosophy, it starts like with the pre-Socratic philosophy, mainly the natural philosophers. And like many of them lived, of course, in Asia Minor, because it was a kind of clash of civilization. Because, for example, several uh, islands had like they were already very influenced by Asia. So of course you already had like different worldviews, and this made you think about something like what is the world like. We then have Socrates in Greek city Athens, which is very special because this city was very conservative, right? So it was like they had still a very profound belief in the gods, and it was even there was a kind of conduct of crime called asebia, which was the kind of like blasphemy if you take it in a modern sense. It was not exactly blasphemy, but it was like a kind of blasphemy if you invented new gods or did not pay respect to the gods, something like this. And he was and Socrates was executed in 399, and one of his teachers was Plato. And we know that something very curious about Socrates is that, many people think that philosophy is asking the questions about why. But I think that is important is that Socrates actually asked questions like, what is? So it was actually what is questions like, what is justice? What is virtue? And Plato took up this concept in his early dialogues, like when you take the Laches, where he asks about what is courage. And we can say that Aristotle, as a student of Plato, he tried to formalize it into a kind of science. So he invented the lot. Of course, Plato already uses this kind of logic. Plato is a very, very logical when he used the dialectic method, and he used also the dialectic method. And so with Aristotle, we do have two things. We talk about induction and deduction. And Aristotle makes clear that deduction, the deductive method, is the only logical method, while an inductive method is invalid because if you take one thing and you look at another thing and you look again at another thing, you cannot be sure that the next thing you look at won't be different. But you cannot from a few individuals take the generalization. But if you know the general rule, you can deduce it down to the singular entity. So this is, to put it in a nutshell, Aristotle's logic. So there is an interesting work, the Nicomachean Ethics, and maybe you want to tell us something about the Nicomachean Ethics?
Yes, it's the work itself is quite remarkable because it is in some ways also mysterious. I mean, alone the title is a bit tricky because we cannot know for sure if he named it after his son or after his father Nicomachos. But the very intriguing part of this book is about some core values for good life. This is what philosophy is very much keen since Socrates, and as some measure also for the sophists who lived more or less at the same age of Socrates.
So the main point is like the first philosophers, they still had like a great connection to metaphysical questions. If you take the first philosophers, like they try to they try to give like the answer, like what was the first element, and they had the kind of like with Empedocles that there is love and strife, and if the two come in harmony, you have the world order. But things that are good are more like if they are attracted to love, and the destructive things are kind of attracted to strife, but both have to like they struggle and they get into harmony, which reminds us a bit like of the Chinese yin and yang, or two forces that are still battling. And even Plato still had the good, so to say, a metaphysical force, a kind of God who is responsible for everything which is good. And the interesting thing with Aristotle, on the opposite, is that he's not an idealist anymore. He takes materialism as ground. So even Aristotle's vision of God is kind of materialistic. It's a kind of God for him is a kind of machine. God cannot act differently than he does, so he kind of acts automatically. And for this reason, it seems like Aristotle's theology is very thin, and he focuses more on ethical questions and, of course, on the tools of science. So he did not use a lot of metaphysical speculation. I think, and this is something it's very new and maybe a certain ground for the further reasoning, because if you look at the other Greek philosophers that came then, partly because from that time on you have the cleavage of idealism and materialism, but those who were materialists, they focus, when they talk about good and bad, they talk about like the virtue of good and bad, like to say it's about ethical or normative behavior which is good or bad, and not anymore about a god or a force which is good or bad. And you also find the same like with the Romans. When you look at Seneca, vita beata, the good life, it's also, of course, to a certain degree, rather a morally good life than a good life according to God, right? So Aristotle is probably the founder of this kind of school where the good is rather found in virtue or the virtuous practice.
Yes, what the Greek called arete, I pronounce it correctly. I think that corresponds more or less to the concept of virtue.
Yes, and the interesting thing is that for Aristotle, virtue is always the middle path. So if you are not in two extremes, but you choose the middle path, then you are virtuous for Aristotle.
Exactly.
Julian, do you have a question to Julia?
Until now, no.
Okay.
I will
Okay.
catch up later.
Okay, sure. So Julia, maybe you want to give us more details about his Nicomachean ethics.
Yes, as you said it, for Aristotle, the evil, no, sorry, the good doesn't know extremes. For him, as all the virtues are the abstinence of excess and the abstinence of abstinence. Like courage is the abstinence of how is it in English? The abstinence of fear and not driving it to extreme, or what we in German call tollkühn, not to make things to not I mean not driving things too far.
Yes, not to cross the border too far.
Exactly.
Or to cross any border that you go too far. But so courage is the absence of fear.
Yes, I mean the absence of an absence. I mean fear is exactly the absence of courage, but there is also something other, the surplus, and this is what defines the borders of something virtuous. But
so if the courage is absent, then we have fear.
Yes, exactly. But how can I say it? The thing is, we have we have to exclude the excess and the abstinence to have the right middle path to go.
So, that's very interesting, because if you look into Plato, and you find in I think it was book 4 of his Republic, you find that the definition of courage is knowing what is dangerous, or knowing about the fearful. So it is the kind of that courage is that you actually know what is dangerous, and that you have the knowledge that you can go through that fearful. So it is not like the absence. I mean, of course, it is a certain absence of fear, but not in a sense that it's the absence of any fear, but it is, what is dangerous, and therefore you don't fear it, because you have the knowledge about, like, let's say, how far you go, or you have an idea about how far you can go. So it is if I see it right, it looks inspired by Plato. But I have to admit, I do not know the Nicomachean Ethics by heart. I mean, I have an idea of it. I also read it, but it's also some time ago. So yes, I have some idea about his political view about friendship, about how to gain felicity in the long run. But about this thing, this is something, and I didn't hear before that Aristotle on this is disclosed. So maybe is there any chapter or anything that where you think that we shall take a look at?
I think one of the most interesting chapter is the last one. If I remember correctly, he talked in the last chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics about the highest good.
Yes, exactly. It is very important. Let me see. I have the Nicomachean Ethics here. It in English it is book, which is funny because last thing we talked about friendship, and friendship or love is book 8 and book 9. These are the two books on friendship, and then we do have the last book 10, about pleasure. And of course, there are also the talk about reasons for discussion, pleasures, and also arguments about pleasure. So maybe when we can take a look inside. I have here the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, translated by Peters, 10th edition, London, 1906. So let me find that chapter, and then we will discuss about this. Because we want to know, of course, the highest good, and actually it is very important to know the highest good, because it was for the Greek people, eudaimonia. It is like the felicity is the thing that people should attain. It is that what Seneca called vita beata, the beautiful life, the good life. It is actually like it is the equivalent to eudaimonia of Aristotle, and actually the whole philosophy of antiquity goes towards this goal. It is always people strive for the good life. It's the highest good, and I found a chapter. Book 10, chapters 1 to 5 are about pleasure, and it starts with reasons for discussion, pleasure. I will give a citation, and we talk about this, because the 10th book starts with citation. Our next business, I think, should be to treat of pleasure, for pleasure seems more than anything else to have an intimate connection with our nature, which is the reason why in educating the young we use pleasure and pain as the rudders of their course. Moreover, delight in what we ought to delight in and hatred of what we ought to hate seem to be of the utmost importance in the formation of a virtuous character, for these feelings pervade the whole of life and have power to draw a man to virtue and happiness as we choose what pleases and shun what pains us. End of quote. So what would you say about this introduction?
it is quite fascinating and also a good jump point. It brings the reader to introduce a very important chapter with a very good starting point, talking also about the basics of human nature. And yes, I think Aristotle tackled quite well um, the natural feelings and effects of the human psyche, and how we should educate and live with it. That's,
So the discussion of what is pleasurable is very important, because uh, he talks about pleasure and pain, and it seems evident that that pleasure seemingly is something good, and we want to avoid pain. So could we say that pleasure, that like pleasure, that things that are pleasurable are also good, and that things that cause pain are evil? Or is this thought too Epicurean?
I will say that he is right that there is um, and not an evidence, but something what seems to be good and seems to be evil, but then we could also go into the nuance and say that there's something which bring us pain in the short term, but something good at the end or at the long term.
Yes.
And I think for the education is plays very much with pain and pleasure, and it should also um, give a child the understanding which pains or pleasures are worth or not worth it. It's like how I'm training my dog. I think all day to him, he should not do this or this, or else why he get punished. And if he repeats the same action in the same conditions, he get even more sanctioned. So it is in this logic that the education should focus on the higher goal. I mean
Yes.
the higher good.
Yes. So we see this when the book continues. Actually, the next passage exactly says, quote, "And it would seem that the discussion of these matters is especially incumbent on us, since there is much dispute about them. There are people who say that the good is pleasure, and there are people who say, on the contrary, that pleasure is altogether bad. Some perhaps in a conviction that it is really so, others because they think it has a good effect on men's lives to assert that pleasure is a bad thing, even though it be not. For the generality of men, they say, incline this way and are slaves to their pleasures, so that they ought to be pulled in the opposite direction, for thus they will be brought into the middle course. But I cannot think that it is right to speak thus, for assertions about matters of feeling and conduct carry less weight than actions, and so when assertions are found to be at variance with palpable facts, they fall into contempt and bring the truth also into discredit. Thus, when a man who speaks ill of pleasure is seen at times to desire it himself, he is thought to show by the fact of being attracted by it that he really considers all pleasure desirable, for the generality of men are not able to draw fine distinctions. It seems then that true statements are the most useful for practice as well as for theory, for being in harmony with facts. They gain credence and so incline those who understand them to regulate their lives by them. But enough of this. Let us now go through the current opinions about pleasure. End of quote. So this is actually the very first part, very first chapter on pleasure. So here we see the thing that Aristotle also disagrees on just looking at pleasure and pain, but that we have to understand like actions and facts, and that we cannot simply reduce it to a feeling.
That's true. Yes, we have um, to see the big picture. um, but I think it's often enabled through experiences how to know which middle ground is most idealist or the best way possible.
Yes, interestingly, because we talked now about pleasure and pain, and of course we could also bring in the question like of we talked about fear. So fear itself is more a painful feeling, right?
Yes.
So in book 3, first we should tell our readers, if you read the book, you see that every chapter builds on. So when you have book 10, what we talk about now, we have like all the arguments from before that like they strive towards this great final. And in book 3, 6 to 9, we find there's a very interesting work by Cursor, by the way, and I will cite now from Cursor's work. He cites 5 charges that are in book 3 and that are actually about this what we talked about courage and about the question of fear. And let's try to bring this part of chapter 3 and chapter 10 together, because Cursor writes, quote, Aristotle, of these 5 charges, I shall argue that Aristotle A does not limit courage to life-threatening situations on the battlefield. Sorry, I should start again. I shall provide a passage by passage interpretation of Aristotle's account of courage in Nicomachean Ethics 3, 6 to 9, which will acquit Aristotle of these 5 charges. I missed the beginning of the sentence. I shall argue that Aristotle A does not limit courage to life-threatening situations on the battlefield. B is right to maintain that courage governs both fear and confidence. C applies a plausible doctrine of the mean to courage. D appropriately distinguishes courage from continence, and E does not affirm that courageous acts are overall pleasant for courageous people. End of quote. Wait, I tell you where you find it. It is in Howard Cursor, Aristotle's account of the virtue of courage in Nicomachean Ethics 3, 6 to 9. And it was published in the Society for Ancient Greek Philosophy newsletter 183 in 1996. So what we see is Cursor argues that courage itself must not have a certain feeling for the person who is courage, or does not have to have a certain feeling for the courageous person, which is the pleasant feeling, which means courage behavior is not always pleasant for courageous people. And we have now seen in chapter 10 that when we talk about the pleasant things and the painful things, that seemingly, if we take in account book 3, that seemingly things that are not pleasurable to us on the, let's say, on the level of feelings, are like pleasurable on the long run because it is the better decision for the soul, right? So how would you bring this part of book 3 and book 10 together? Because seemingly here we see an argument which is against that always just pleasurable things are good things, because seemingly something unpleasurable might be good, because courage behavior is good.
Um, mm, so Howard Cursor was the um, the Aristotle researcher who commented the different factors about Aristotle's vision of courage.
Yes.
This is interesting. So I noted that courage is not the same as continence. That's it's perhaps one of the most intriguing of the four elements I've noticed. So, but
But do you agree in general that the pleasurable does not equal always the good? Because a person might be courage and has to choose a painful action to act better than if he just chooses simply the pleasant thing.
yes, exactly. If someone wants to be courageous, he has to how we can say this, put himself together to do I mean to act rightly without an self-made excuse, and to to be obedient toward own principles, not um, and not doing what is told to do is not necessary kind of courage, but to confront fears which are by definition painful, and so to do what you I mean to do what you should achieve.
Okay. And you mentioned that you were surprised by the fact about continence and courage. And I have, of course, the the passage where he writes about this, so that we both can be stunning about the way he writes this, because it's a very, very fascinating way how Cursor writes it. He writes, quote, continence and katreia is illustrated when the parameters of the fear and or confidence targets are not medial, but the parameters of the choice and action targets are medial. Incontinence, akrateia, is illustrated when the parameters of fear and or confidence targets and the action target are not medial, but the parameters of the choice target are medial. Vice is illustrated when the parameters of the fear and or confident targets and the choice and action targets are not medial. End of quote. So it is actually something where we are already very deep in detail. So it seems that we saw that virtuous behavior is always you act medial or you act in a middle way. And seemingly, if there's a certain parameter which is not medial, then you act in a continent way. And if there's another parameter where you are in the middle way or medial, but where you are not, but where the other parameter is not in the middle or medial way, then again there is a certain extreme of some of the parameters and you act incontinent. So it is kind of, Aristotle shows that like only when you have a balanced action, then you act virtuous. While when there is just like one extreme, which is a very, very strong parameter, then it might be that you are driven or that towards that parameter, or that you strive towards that, and which will lead you that you get away from the middle way probably, or that you get to a certain direction. We know this is from his political view. You know, it's that like if there is like only the rich people governing, it will be an extreme, and if only the poor people are governing is an extreme. So the rich and poor and all the classes, it has to be like put in the middle, you know, because because if only the people on the extremes are the one like who are governing, the ones who are rich will only protect their richness, and the poor will only try to survive. And so both will start like they have special interests. And Aristotle thinks that those who are more in the middle, they will not be extremely the ones who will take everything away because they are hungry, but they will also not because they do not have so much, probably. I guess so. This is my interpretation. Or they will probably not try to preserve everything because they are not the ones who have everything to lose. So this is the thing about the middle way. And so, of course, courage we see is that when we talk about fear, is that it's not about do I understand it right that it's not about overcoming fear in general, but that it's about that you are able to distinguish these two parameters, that you are able to distinguish courage from continence, and that you are able to see what is good on the long term.
Yes, I mean, I think it's this more nuanced approach of Aristotle, how he described courage, not only overcome fear, but also much more systematic idea of it.
And what is so systematic about it? Is it more that the way we see that he takes into account several parameters and say, hey, if you take this and that, then you have this, and if you take that and that, then you have that? Is this the thing that is systematic, or is it what makes this approach newer than, for example, Plato's approach?
I don't know how to formulate and it seems I would say it a bit complicated, but I think yeah, it's I think it's like you said, it's with all these parameters and with all the characteristics he added that makes his definition of courage more nuanced.
Okay, so it is the way that because he takes it like step by step on a logical on a formal way, is because he always goes on and rules out a thing and then shows that the like you have two things and he rules one out, and so there is one thing left, and then he takes a look inside that thing and sees what it contains and sees it could be A or B, and then he rules out probably B, and then he looks into A and sees there is like 1 and 2 inside, and then he sees like, okay, it's not 1, it is 2, and then so it's the way he goes inside the things.
Yes, it's a bit more complicated as Plato did, but it's also in a very proper manner. It's we can see here a very clear kind of reasoning and logical deduction.
Okay, Julian, until now it's Timo Talks philosophy. How about you? What would you ask?
Yeah, so you talked because I'm just picking up on some things because I'm really not I'm not knowledgeable at all when it comes to the subject. But one thing that maybe I picked up is when you talked about like suffering, I believe at one point.
Yes.
And
yes.
So basically it was like suffering can only, I don't know, can be in a way virtuous, if I understood like the idea right.
Actually, maybe it's because we have the feeling that pain is suffering, but I don't think that for Aristotle it's here about suffering in general. It is more like you have to choose an action, and there are two ways you can do it. Like normally you might have one extreme view and you might have another extreme view, but both views are wrong, because you can only act in a good way if you act more temperated, more like if you act more calmly. And in the same way, it might be that that when we do an action, we, of course, we always choose the way which is most pleasant to us. You know, we always like to do it in a way which is most suitable, most simple, most where we do not have to tackle anything. But it might be that this way is actually one of these two extremes, which means that on the long term, the outcome is actually not virtuous, because you are driven to one of these extremes, which means that it's not balanced. And so,
yeah, but on the other hand, you said this scenario in which we would not choose only like the actions that will usually result in us receiving pleasure. But on the other hand, I see another extreme, and this is like a more Christian-centric one, in which people are kind of encouraged to suffer, in the idea that suffering in its way might bring a type of pleasure afterward. It's like
salvation.
Yeah, like salvation, but I think is that martyr syndrome, in which people basically are encouraged to suffer as I don't know, a means of living. And at the end of the day, I think that to a very big extent, people are naturally inclined towards like seeking pleasure. I mean, it's like a type of masochism to actually go and like to see suffering as something to strive for. Well, I think strive for it's maybe a little bit stretch, but to actually make it an integral part of your life, as normalizing it.
Yes, the point is that the big question of Greek philosophy was like, how can we have a happy life? How can every one of us live in the best way possible? So it is like, for the ancient Greek, it was not like the Christian thing that you get born and you have to accept your fate. If you are lucky, you are the king, and if you are poor, you are a poor peasant who has to accept his fate in the hard life and then if you master this task of your hardships, you will receive rewards after salvation. about Aristotle, he does not have this kind of metaphysical questions. For him, it is also not like to be happy at the moment. To him, it is that when you look back to your life, if you look back on your life, that you can say, I lived a happy life. So it's not happiness for you choose a happy action now, but on the long run, you did not have real happiness. But you have to choose in a way so that you can say, in the end of your life, I lived, my life all overall was a quite successful one, was a quite happy one.
I think that what usually the parts like as you said, like Christianity, when it comes to like the idea of happiness, is like you suffer, but in a way, the salvation and happiness that you will obtain at the end is like eternal, in comparison to, maybe, I don't know if this is your point, but I know like the pagan perspective was the fact that life in itself is like a cycle of like bad and good moments. It's not like there is like an end point in which you will obtain like permanent happiness. It's just, people always go like through years of their life in which, they are more prosperous, things go good for them. And yes, maybe everything is like really bad. You get very ill, or like one of your parents die. And, these cycles repeat again and again until we die. So it's not, I think this idea of eternal happiness, as this is from my personal study, because I didn't study Greek philosophy. This idea of like eternal happiness, it's much more was pushed, or you see it like in question thinking?
Maybe people in an Epicurean discourse, or people who are fond of Epicurus, tend to say like you have to it's the best way to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. And this is, for example, something very important to understand utilitarianism. And Aristotle is not, it does not, for example, does not agree to such an idea. Aristotle thinks like that you might have to choose something which is which right now is difficult for you, which is not like actually where you have maybe to sacrifice something, but on the long run it will be better that you go the, let's say, the harder way, the more difficult way, than if you choose the pleasant way, always on pleasant on accumulating pleasure and avoiding pain, because this kind of pleasure is only of short term. This is just now, but you have to behave in a way that you act virtuous, because this is the way you. Or that is what Greeks generally think, that if you act virtuous, it is good for your soul. So of course, it is the question on how do you achieve the highest good for your soul, that you have a healthy soul, and that when you die, that your soul will be kind of clean. So though of course, as I said, Aristotle is not the one who does the metaphysical speculation what comes after life. It's more about that he thinks like, okay, that in the end of the life, how do you have attained the most highest good, or how did you come close to the most highest good? And this is like that through virtue, and virtue is does always mean avoiding extremes. And if you say you should always choose pleasure over pain, it is a kind of extreme already, because you choose an extreme view, which means always pleasure, never pain. And this is not a virtuous way. And the courageous person seemingly knows about fear, but he is not driven by fear, because it's a bit tricky, because I don't know Aristotle in the deep detail here, but I think as far as I understood him until now, and the interesting thing is that people who read Aristotle, some people are still like have read Aristotle for 30 years, and they still develop new ideas. So it's not something where I can say I read it and I have a final view. So I'm also developing my view, and I think like that about, because she's really a difficult writer and has a lot of deep wisdom inside. But I think one thing is about that when we go to fear, there is like, if you are always driven by fear, you cannot enjoy your life. But if you have no fear, then you will probably have the problem that you become a kind of arrogant, that you don't see life anymore, that you dare too much and put yourself into danger because you don't have any fear anymore. And maybe the courageous person in a certain kind is able to distinguish about, for example, about confidence, and also the continence that we said, so that there are different parameters that and that he sees that he might have to be courage, that he acts in a way that is right now not pleasant to him, but that will in the end have the better outcome. We all know this. I take an everyday life example. We all know this. Maybe we have to go to our boss and tell him a bad news. This is not a pleasant thing, but it is better to tell him than not to tell him, So on the long run, it is better when you have given him the news than trying to avoid the pain that you might have by telling the message. So here you might be courage, but it is not pleasant.
Yeah, I totally agree, because just seeking pleasure, I mean, it's I can relate this like even like in many other ways, even like in like the greatest like works of art that you have in humanity were born out of like suffering. So if like suffering would had always been avoided, maybe we wouldn't have progressed as we did, because I think under suffering and pain, usually our minds work very differently than when we are in a very relaxed, I mean, when we are in our comfort zone, to say so.
Yes. So this is very important. Virtue for a long, long time was understood under the influence of Aristotle as a kind of middle way. And by the way, it is very interesting that also in Buddhism, where you want to overcome suffering, how do you overcome suffering? It is by going at first a middle way. You get rid of extremes, because if you attach to someone too much, you suffer. That's one extreme. If you, however, if you don't care about others, that's the other extreme, but you might be only ego-centered because you only care about yourself and not the others, so that's the other extreme. So on the one hand, you should not cling too much on others. On the other hand, you should let your ego go. So again, you have a middle way to overcome suffering, because if you get driven to one extreme, it will cause more suffering, and you will not be able to push forward your teaching, your practice. So if you are on the middle way, if you are in this way, you can get insights and push forward your teaching. And I think this is a very important point. So getting away from extremes is always that you have the chance to look left and right. You have the global overview. So I think we should go to the summary now, because we had a very productive session, and I'm also very proud of Julien, because it is, I think, his first time that he ever speaks about such a subject in front of the public, and I think, and even a very difficult. We chose a very difficult
It's
subject.
very different. I mean, I can speak for myself, just listening, not just like he did so much thinking. I just listened, and I had at one point the sensation that I got overloaded, just from listening, because there are so many I feel that when we debate such subjects, I mean, we debate them all the time, but it is sometimes unavoidable that you kind of get stuck at one point when you receive the information, because it's it's a lot. And I think, and this is maybe an advice for our listeners, and not only for our podcast, it's for academic information and knowledge in general. Don't expect that from you when you you come in contact with information, with some knowledge in the first time. You should expect that you already have to understand it at a deep level, because that will be many times not the case. It kind of settles down as time progresses, and when you encounter or you go through certain situations or scenarios, you kind of tend to see it more in a context and to see the links between the concept that you use, because when you come in contact with it for the first time, it's very raw. So it's not something unusual to be a little bit scared that you don't understand everything that you hear, at the first presentation.
Yes, how to say it? It's a very, in fact, like in philosophy altogether, and process approach, something one should have step by step. I think for me and for new podcast hearers, it's a maybe how can I say it? It's not every day that one here will participate in a philosophical debate with other. But I find it good to begin with one step. Like if philosophy has also its first its starting points. Like Aristotle said, wonder. Philosophy starts with wonder, and it's I found Christian approach also very marvelous. It's like it's actually a pleasure to philosophize that for me also to think more about, and I
Yes.
think also the I could say it one of the last chapters or even the last chapter of the Nicomachean ethics is also that it's very pleasant to think about things, um, and that philosophy is one of the highest pleasure. And ironically, philosophers had often enough money or enough time to think about the way things are.
Yes, this is the thing we discussed about the educate when we had the episode about education, that the problem in the past was, of course, that that people, though they were financially in the that though they were financially independent and therefore could do a very pure reasoning, the problem was that it was only limited to those who were financially independent. So while it was more difficult for those who were, let's say, from lower classes, because they did not have the time and the money to do such kinds of researches. So yes, of course, on the one hand, that's actually a very interesting thing about the Greek isonomia, because it means like the rule of the equal, but it also means the rule not like that everyone is equal, but that you are equal among your peers, which means that the ones who were citizens have the same rank, and that, for example, all the slaves are equal, but not that a slave and a citizen is of the same rank. It's just like that you are equal among your peers. And it was like that was the rule among equals, so that no citizen was more worth than another citizen, but it was not a totally equal society. We have to be aware of that. So to put it in a nutshell, what we talked about today, Julien, you pointed out that Aristotle's organon gave the birth to formal scientific logic. We saw that already Plato used this logic. So it was not the use of logic was not something new, but writing down systematically what logic means and what ways what ways of reasoning we do have to put this systematic scheme. He was the first one to do this scientific approach. And so of course he is like the founder of the scientific reasoning, the scientific logic. And he shaped this very much because the way he understood logic was used in antiquity. It was also used in the Middle Ages. The scholastic philosophy still used Aristotelian reasoning. It was used until Francis Bacon in the Renaissance actually said, hey, people, we need to also use inductive reasoning and science, because with deductive reasoning, you can only prove what you already found, but you cannot find new things. So Aristotle's deduction as the only right way of logic survived for a very, very, very long time. And it is still until today, it's just like that the deduction is the better way of reasoning. Because induction always means that you can only assume something, but you never can be sure that it really is this way, because you can only say, as Kant said, until now, we do not have any exception to this rule, but it does not mean that there is no exception. So Aristotle gave this foundation. Then, Julien, you showed us that about his ethics. He wrote 3 books on ethics, and we looked at the Nicomachean ethics, and you showed us about courage, which was very interesting, because the way you presented it, we could see on the one hand the continuosity of the development of the term courage, but also the difference, because courage for Plato as for Aristotle deals with fear, like the question of what is fearful, or how do we have to have a stance to the fear, but seemingly in the overall reply of Aristotle is a bit different, because for Plato it is like you are courageous if you are if you know of what is dangerous or what is and what is not, and what you know what you have to fear of. And for Aristotle, it is like you have different parameters, and if you are too fearful, if you only live in fear, you will not be able to make courageous decisions. Nonetheless, it seems like also that if you have no respect for the danger, then you cannot act courageous in a certain way. So you do have certain parameters, and if one of these parameters strives too far into an extreme, you have the problem that you generally tend to get into a certain extreme. So to be courageous, you have to bring the different parameters into harmony. Sadly, we could not discuss everything in detail because it is really it would be an overload for everyone. And as I said, even those scholars who did research for a very, very long time, they still find something new inside it because it is so detailed. But we can see that the middle way or the medial is the ideal way to act virtuous, arete. And the work, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, strives towards answering the question, what is the highest good? So the whole work, all the books inside this Nicomachean Ethics, strive towards answering step by step this question. And so when we talked about book 10, we had also to put book 3 into consideration, because there are basics in other books that you need to understand the last book. So it is a really built step by step, reasoned very profoundly, which very systematically. So this is something which is new with Plato and Aristotle, because about the ones we know before, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and today we only have fragments, which means we do not have the full works, and we do not have like the full reasoning of them, because we only know certain phrases or certain sayings from them. And with Plato and Aristotle, we have a full oeuvre. We do have many books.
Exactly.
Yes, they probably are not complete, but there might be a lost work. We do not know, but they are. We really do have an oeuvre that we can look at, and we can see the systematics. And of course, with Aristotle, it is very important because he builds up step by step, and it is good if you have the whole manuscript to know actually what he builds on.
I think I have to excuse myself. Because I have to break the dialogue now up. Have to do go. My dad is now here to.
Sure. We come to an end right now. I think we said everything, and of course we talked for a long time. So it is time, let's say, to close this episode. Is there anything you want to add, Julian?
No.
Okay, then thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you to my guest, Julien Sita. It was very insightful, and it was great that you had your debut in our podcast. We are very happy that you chose us to where you want to explain Aristotle. And don't forget to share the link of this episode, to give us a like, to comment, and to tell your friends about this podcast, so that we can, because if you like this podcast, it would be great if you help us in reaching a greater audience. So that would be very great. And see you, or better, hear you next time. Bye.
Goodbye. See you next time. Have a nice